Hi, and welcome back to my channel. In today's video, you have the next edition of Recent Reads. I think it's episode number 14. And in this edition, I do have all of the books, and it's a more reasonable stack than last week, as it should be, because last week was spring break. This week is not. I was back to school. And also, I kind of took a break because I had this unstated goal of reading at least a book a day, not the actual days, but 31 in the month, and I realized that I would get to that point and probably surpass that point if I kept reading at the same pace. So the first few days of this week I didn't listen to an audiobook. I did end up picking it up later in the month because it's a new month, it's April, and I have that a book a day again goal, and I also want to do well on the 2 readathons that I'm in. All of that aside, here are the 4 books that I read this week. I read 2 as audiobooks and 2 physically. The book that I read physically throughout the week is Crown of Feathers by Miki Palpretto. As you may have seen in my wrap-up, I classified this one as mixed media because on the day that I went down for the half marathon near Charleston with my mom, I presented 2 options and she went with the other one. But I still had to get the car, her car, I think, back to her house. And so I started this one as an audiobook on Scribd. I was enjoying it. Switched to the other audiobook for the ride down and the ride back, finished that, then started this week and tried to find it on Scribd, and it wasn't there. I could not find it. I knew for a fact that I had it in the saved portion of Scribd. It wasn't there. So I looked it up and it said available on April 8th. Seriously, Scribd, you're supposed to be unlimited. Also, I had already started listening to this book. And you're like, nope, it magically doesn't appear here. Okay. So I had to switch and finish this physically. Long story to get to the fact that I finished this physically. And I talked about in my wrap up, because I did finish this in March, just how fascinated that I was with the relationship between the sisters. I'm really intrigued by it. I thought it was a duology. And I thought with the purchase that I have that's going to come later this week, I think, that I had gotten the rest of the series. No, there's another one that I need to get. But I'm really intrigued by this world and the magic of this world. I will say that the chronology, the history of it, is a little muddy. And the way that Palpretto talks about this at the beginning of the book makes me think that all of the events unseating the Phoenix Rider Queens happened generations ago. No, they happened 1 generation ago, like 16, 17 years. And that was a little muddy throughout the first portion. I gradually figured it out. That could have been clarified. That kept it from being a 5-star. Additionally, I didn't necessarily care for Seb's perspectives. Like, I got them. I saw why they're necessary. The way that he interacts with a character in there that becomes connected to Veronica at the end of the book. But this world is not one that I've read about before in a fantasy world, and it really got me thinking. We go from a really intriguing fantasy world where the writing was executed on and the characters fit right in, things made sense, to one where the world was intriguing, but the execution, for me, felt lacking. I really did like the idea of having these... Sorry, I kicked something under my desk. I really did like the idea of having these 3 characters with these different interactions, and the fact that the first character that you see, I think is this one, if I remember correctly. I did listen to this as an audiobook. But also, actually I forget the order that you're introduced into the characters. But the typical love story that you would expect to see in a YA fantasy does not play out the way that you would expect to see it. A certain connection about a long-lost love does become blatantly obvious, especially in the beginning. But that wasn't a bad thing. That was fine. I was like, okay, how are we going to reveal this? How are things going to unfold here? And there's 2 main things the characters are trying to figure out. So I'm trying to remember the names of these different characters. Okay, so Aziza is Lebanese American. Her parents, I believe, were immigrants. Her parents or grandparents they're immigrants. She lives in this town. I don't know if it's ever said what town they live in, but it's on the edge of, what's the word? I can't remember the word for it, but you know, fairyland. That's a terrible word for it, but my mind is blanking on the word for it. And she's a hedge witch, so she maintains that boundary. And something is happening that's weakening that boundary. And she's noticing, I'm having a lot more work to do here. What is going on? That brings her into contact with Leo, who is not magical, but suffers, he and his family, except for his sister, suffer from a curse that his parents won't tell him about. Like his mom, whenever she speaks, frogs fall out of her mouth. That would be, oh, don't like that idea. His dad, I'm not even really sure what it was. That was possibly because I was mishearing some things in the audiobook, but I think there's some sort of spirit attached to his dad that makes mischief. And so he's really the breadwinner for his family because his parents, they can't work. And then you have Tristan. Yes, Tristan, who was not magical, but now is magical because he's made a terrible bargain with a hag. And a hag is a witch that has gone bad, to put it simply. So they all become intermeshed and they all have to work together to solve the big bad. So solving the big bad, and also, especially for Leo, figuring out what cursed his parents and how to break it is a really big motivating driving factor in this book. I will say there was a little bit of creepiness that's not necessarily my taste that was in here that I didn't really like, but it wasn't terrible. It wouldn't have put me off this book. It would have kept me from a 5 stars. But it ended up letting me down because the resolution, like, you figure out the curse thing, but the curse is not broken. And everyone seems to be okay with that, which it was built up for so long as something that they're trying to do. So in the end, it just sort of fell flat for me and ended up being an average 3-star read. Then we come to a book that was the first book that I read in April, was not necessarily one that was on my radar at all until this class that I'm taking for my TESOL degree, teaching English speakers of other languages. And we have this assignment where a novel comparison where we have to write a reflection on a novel, a specific novel, and then exchange it with another person in the class and then add a paragraph, I guess, comparing the comparisons. That didn't come out well. But anyway, you're not here for my school update. This is the book, Return to Sender by Julia Alvarez. I was excited to see this because I have read a Julia Alvarez book before. Antes de ser libres. I read it in Spanish and I have the English version of it that I want to read. I really enjoyed it. And I don't know whether it was because I read it in Spanish or because it's a different setting. Antes de ser libres, Before We Are Free, is slightly historical. This is also slightly historical, but Antes de ser libres is a little bit more historical. And it more fully centers the Dominican experience, Dominican Republic. This one, it's a dual narrative between Tyler and Maria. And both Tyler and Maria are going into 6th grade, but in Vermont, where this is set, it's still part of elementary school. That happens sometimes. But this is considered a middle grade book. Tyler lives on a farm, but they're struggling because his grandpa just died earlier in the summer, and then his dad was in a terrible tractor accident and is rehabbing and stuff for that. So they need workers for it, and his brother is about to go off to college. So they bring on some other workers because other members of the family also farm, and they're like, hey, bring in these Mexican workers. And so Mari's family has moved from North Carolina to Vermont to work on this farm, but they're also dealing with you could call it a disappearance, the non-return of her mother. Her mother went back to Mexico because her grandmother was about to die, the mother's mother, and was supposed to come back, and they had received word, but then it had been months and months and months and months. So both families are dealing with things in here. Tyler's experience is very white, very solidly American farm. You could almost think that this was set in the Midwest with some of the things that went on, although it's rural Vermont, which is also very white. And he has a lot of ideas that are fully fixed in that sort of culture, which makes sense. And his ideas are challenged by Mari and the family, her two sisters who are American citizens. Mari was 4 when her parents crossed illegally, so she's not. And so he has to struggle and wrestle with that. I haven't put this through Copilot yet. I don't know what I'm going to rate it. It was fine, but I have read many other examples of books that deal with the immigrant experience, even with someone who is not an immigrant, learning and being challenged in their views by immigrants. I've just read much better. This felt, I don't know what the word I want for this is. It felt canned, it felt trite, and that was disappointing to me, which makes me wonder if I am going to enjoy Antes de ser libres when I read it in English. I'm like, what did I love so much about that other book that I read in Spanish? Maybe it's just this book. I don't know. This did win a Pura Belpre award. Maybe I'm being too harsh in my review. It wasn't bad. So this will probably end up a very high 3.5 or a 4-star read. And I'm not going to unhaul it. This is a good example. It just didn't live up to the expectation that I had set in my mind with the other book that I had read by her. And then we come to the book that I just finished, and one that I knew I would enjoy, but it took me by surprise with how much I appreciated the experience. And that is The Longest Race, Inside the Secret World of Abuse, Doping, and Deception on Nike's Elite Running Team. Obviously, I'm a runner. I follow American running. When I was first getting into it, the big names were people like Desiree Linden and Shalane Flanagan and Kara Goucher. That's Kara Goucher. When I first really got into it, it was 2012 Olympics, where it was Shalane, Des, and Kara representing the US. Des had some sort of hamstring injury and she wasn't able to finish the run. But Kara and Shalane had been training together for a while, and they finished 9 and 10, and everyone was like, oh, that was such a good race. And when she talked about it in here, it was very eye-opening, very revealing. I will admit that I had some views of Kara as a person that I think were shaped and manipulated by the behemoth that is Nike. And the comments and things that went on after her decision to come forward and talk about what had happened during her time there and what she had seen. There were times where I'm like, oh, she's going with Loiselle, she's washed up, she finished this race and she was crying, that's ridiculous. Is it ridiculous? No. And some of the quote-unquote washed up stuff, you know what, was likely a consequence of the ridiculous training that she was put through, the way that she was treated when she got pregnant, gave birth. There are also a lot of other things that have come to light, and I've listened to a lot of podcasts with her. I don't know if I still subscribe to the podcast or not, or if it's still ongoing, but she has this podcast with a couple other people called the Clean Sport Collective. And I listened to a lot on there, and she talked a lot about some of the doping allegations and some of the things that she had to do, things that she had to testify about in that. And a lot started to change in there for me. And in this book, she also reveals something that she never talked about in that podcast, and she hadn't talked about publicly until this book. It gets into allegations, which I believe she's being truthful about, of things very similar to what Larry Nassar did to the Olympic gymnasts. And if you know, you know. I'm not going to say out loud, obviously, on this video, which, knowing what I know now and all of the things that have come out, unfortunately makes a lot of sense. And so many people were like, why didn't you leave? You had your best running under him. This is such a powerful book that really examines the psyche of a person as they endure various things. She talks about her stepdad growing up and the fact that her mom's second marriage was really not all that great because, frankly, her stepdad was a big man baby. That clearly had an impact on her, developing her psyche and growing up. She talks about her struggles with disordered eating when she was in college. She talks about her relationship with her husband, Adam, who, mad props to Adam. He's very stand-up guy. I also give mad props to her grandfather, her mother's father. And then she talks about her time with Alberto Salazar and the Nike Oregon Project. And just so many people have come out and shared their experiences. And that's just too much confirmation for there to be any doubt on what went on. When some of these things started coming out, I made the decision, I'm never buying a piece of Nike gear. I'm just not. Is it going to hurt Nike? No. No way. Nike's a behemoth. Nike has massive monopolies. It's not fair. It's not right. It makes me sad that some of my favorite runners still are sponsored by Nike, but I understand why, because they want to make a living in professional running, and the company with the money to pay for it is Nike. This is just very powerful, very profound. I'm glad this was my first audiobook read of April. This needs to be more widely read. So there you have it. There are the 4 books that I read this week that finished up March. 5 of the 7 days were in March and 2 were in April. I read 2 in those 5 days and then 2 in those 2 days. So what can you tell about my reading speed? You really can't. Thanks so much for watching. I hope to see you in the next one.